The stale air in the small apartment was heavy, thick with the ghosts of yesterday. It smelled of dust, cold coffee, and the lingering phantom scent of his wife's perfume on a scarf still draped over a chair. Leo, only 38, felt 100 years old. His carpenter's hands, usually covered in sawdust and purpose, now rested uselessly on his lap, the calluses feeling strangely smooth. The silence was his tormentor, a vast emptiness where his 7-year-old daughter's giggles and his wife's laughter once echoed. Every creak of the floorboards, every drip from the kitchen faucet, was an agonizing reminder of what was lost. His gaze drifted to his professional-grade tools, packed neatly in their cases near the door. Monuments to a business that had been bled dry by a torrent of medical bills. They sat there gathering a thin film of dust, a silent testament to his failure. On the rickety kitchen table, a single piece of paper lay under the weak yellow glow of the lone lamp. It wasn't just paper, it was a verdict. The words, "Final Notice," stamped in brutal red ink, screamed at him from across the room. Each letter, a nail being hammered into his coffin. He forced himself to stand, his joints aching as if filled with ground glass. His phone, its screen cracked and spiderwebbed, felt cold in his hand. He tapped the banking app, his thumb hovering over the icon for a long second, dread coiling in his gut like a cold snake. He didn't want to see it, but he had to. The number glowed with an almost insulting brightness against the dark screen. $2,800. He whispered the amount, the sound swallowed by the silence. $2,800. It was the liquidation of his van, the sale of his finest saws, the humiliating calls to friends for small loans he knew he couldn't repay. It was the ghost of his savings, the final remnant of a life built with sweat and wood, now reduced to a few digits on a screen. A wave of nausea rose in his throat as the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital flooded his memory. The incessant, rhythmic beeping of machines that had become the soundtrack to his wife's last days. Each beep had been another bill, another piece of his life being chipped away. The eviction notice wasn't a threat, it was a promise. A countdown timer ticking away the final seconds of his life in this home. A floorboard creaked under his weight as he moved toward the other room, and he froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He held his breath, listening. Silence. Mia was still asleep. He stood in the doorway of her tiny bedroom, a space he had lovingly built a fortress of imagination for her, with hand-carved animals on a shelf and glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her small chest under a worn-out unicorn blanket. A surge of love, so powerful it was physically painful, washed over him, but it was immediately chased by a spike of icy terror that stole the air from his lungs. This tiny, perfect human was his entire world, the only piece of his wife he had left. The thought of her sleeping in a car, or worse, a crowded, impersonal shelter, was a physical blow. He could almost feel the cold concrete, smell the bleach and despair. He pictured her small hand in his, her face looking up at him with confused, frightened eyes, and his stomach twisted into a hard, painful knot. He would do anything to protect her, absolutely anything. But he had no idea what to do. He retreated from her door, the image of her sleeping face burned into his mind. Back in the living room, the grief, which had been a dull, constant ache, sharpened into a blade. He felt hollowed out, a structure whose foundations had been ripped away, leaving only a fragile, collapsing frame. He walked to the sink, and his fingers brushed against a ceramic mug with a chipped rim, a silly floral pattern his wife had loved. The smooth, cool porcelain was a stark contrast to the rough calluses on his hands. A single, hot tear escaped and tracked a path through the grime on his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. What was the point? He was drowning in a sea of loss, and this was just one more drop of salt water. The city hummed outside his window, a distant siren, the rumble of a passing truck, sounds from a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away, a world he no longer belonged to. He was a carpenter who couldn't build his way out of this, a husband without his wife, a man staring into an abyss, haunted by the ghost of the strong, capable person he used to be. His hands, which had once framed houses, now trembled as they gripped the counter's edge. Leo sank into the worn armchair, its springs groaning a weary complaint that matched his own soul. He let his head fall into his hands, the rough skin of his palms scraping against his stubbled cheeks. The terror was no longer a wave. It was the entire ocean, and he was submerged, unable to breathe. 14 days. The words from the eviction notice pulsed behind his closed eyelids. 14 days until he and Mia were homeless. His mind raced in a frantic, useless spiral, a hamster on a wheel running towards a cliff. He could feel his heart beating a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. Where do we go? What do I do? The questions were a meaningless chant, echoing in the vast emptiness of his mind. There were no answers. There was only the crushing, suffocating weight of his failure. In this moment of absolute despair, with the city's indifferent sounds filtering through the thin glass, he felt the last flicker of hope dying inside him. He was at the bottom, a place so dark he couldn't even see the shape of his own hands in front of his face. If you've ever felt the cold grip of desperation, you know the choices it can force you to make. Follow our channel to discover what desperate choice Leo makes next, and subscribe so you don't miss the haunting story that unfolds. In the suffocating gloom of his apartment, illuminated only by the cold blue light of his phone screen, a flicker of something dangerous ignited within Leo. Hope. It was a classified ad, buried deep on a website for rural properties. The picture was grainy, low resolution, showing a rustic cabin half hidden by overgrown trees. The description was brutally honest, and for that reason, felt trustworthy. Isolated cabin on 1.5 acres, sold as is. No utilities, needs work. And then the price, a number so low it made Leo's breath catch in his throat. $2,000 to $500. It felt like a typo, a cruel joke. But as he read it again, the hope grew from a flicker to a flame. He could almost smell the pine, feel the solid wood under his hands as he repaired it. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a blank canvas, a project, a fortress he could build for Mia with his own 2 hands, a place where debt couldn't find them, where the ghosts of the city couldn't follow. The thought was intoxicating, a powerful anesthetic for his grief and fear. His finger hovered over the contact button, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. $2,500. It would leave him with only $300. $300 to feed himself and a 7-year-old girl, to buy gas, to survive until he could make this ruin livable. It was reckless. It was insane. It was a gamble with his daughter's life as the stake. The logical part of his brain screamed warnings, listing 1,000 things that could go wrong. The wood could be rotted beyond repair, the foundation could be cracked, the isolation could be a trap, not a refuge. But the voice of despair was louder. What was the alternative? A homeless shelter, a slow, humiliating slide into destitution on the city streets? He looked again at Mia's bedroom door, at the fortress of imagination he'd built that was about to be torn down. He felt a fierce, protective resolve harden in his chest. This wasn't a choice. It was the only path left. He took a deep, shuddering breath and pressed the call button. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic activity. The phone call was brief, the transaction a cold, impersonal wire transfer to a numbered company. There was no negotiation, no questions asked. Leo felt a thrill of terror and excitement as he watched the number in his bank account plummet. It was done. The cabin was his. He moved through the apartment like a man possessed, packing their lives into cardboard boxes and duffel bags. He was ruthless, abandoning furniture, kitchenware, anything that wouldn't fit in his beaten-up pickup truck. Each discarded item felt like shedding a layer of his old, failed life. He tried to project an air of cheerful adventure for Mia, telling her they were going to a special new house in the woods, a place where they could have a campfire every night. She seemed to catch his forced enthusiasm, her questions more curious than fearful. As he loaded the final box, containing his precious tools, he paused and took one last look at the apartment. The empty rooms echoed with memories, but the red eviction notice on the table was the only thing that felt real. He grabbed it, crumpled it in his fist, and walked out without looking back. The journey was long, a slow transition from one world to another. The concrete and steel of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, which then dissolved into flat, endless highways. The constant hum of traffic was gradually replaced by the drone of his truck's engine and the whistling of the wind. Mia, lulled by the motion, slept for hours in the passenger seat, her head resting on a pillow propped against the window. Leo drove with a grim determination, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. With every mile, he felt the city's grip loosening, but a new kind of anxiety began to creep in. The gas gauge dipped lower and lower, a constant, nagging reminder of his dwindling resources. He had spent the last of his cash on a full tank of gas and a bag of sandwiches, chips, and juice boxes. He ate mechanically, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. He was driving toward a place he had only seen in a single, blurry photograph, a place where he had sunk the last of his money. The hope that had burned so brightly in his apartment now felt like a fragile, sputtering candle in a hurricane. The paved highway eventually ended, forcing him onto a cracked and weathered secondary road. 10 miles later, his GPS instructed him to turn onto a narrow dirt track that seemed to be swallowed by a dense, dark forest. The truck bounced and groaned over deep ruts and loose stones, the branches of overgrown trees scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. The sun, which had been bright and clear, seemed to be filtered out by the thick canopy of leaves, plunging the path into a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, heavier. He could smell damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal, ancient scent that was both clean and unsettling. Mia woke up and looked around, her eyes wide. "Are we there, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small in the sudden, profound silence that fell every time the truck slowed to navigate a particularly rough patch. "Almost, sweetie," Leo lied, his own heart beginning to pound with a sick sense of dread. The isolation he had craved now felt menacing, absolute. There were no other houses, no signs of life, just the endless, whispering trees. Finally, after another mile that felt like 100, the GPS announced, "You have arrived." Leo pulled the truck into a small, weed-choked clearing and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the countryside he had imagined. It was a heavy, oppressive stillness, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the distant caw of a crow. And there it was, the cabin. The photograph hadn't been grainy. It had been forgiving. The reality was a punch to the gut. It wasn't rustic. It was derelict. It slumped to one side as if the earth were trying to reclaim it. The porch sagged precariously, and a large section of the roof had caved in, leaving a gaping black hole that stared up at the sky like a dead eye. The windows were boarded up with mismatched, rotting planks of wood. It didn't look like a place that needed work. It looked like a place that needed to be burned to the ground. Leo sat frozen in his seat, the car keys feeling like ice in his hand. He could feel Mia's questioning gaze on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look at her. A wave of cold, crippling despair washed over him, so intense it made him feel dizzy. This was not a new beginning. This was the end. He had taken his grieving, vulnerable daughter and his last $300 and driven them to a tomb. He finally forced himself to turn to Mia, plastering a weak, unconvincing smile on his face. "Here we are," he said, his voice cracking. "Our new adventure." The lie felt like broken glass in his mouth. He got out of the truck, and the smell hit him with full force. It was a thick, foul stench of rot, of mildew, and something else, a sour, animal smell that spoke of years of infestation. The air was heavy and damp, and he could feel the moisture seeping into his clothes, into his very bones. He took a few hesitant steps towards the cabin, his boots sinking into the soft, muddy ground. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the truck, turn around and drive away. But there was nowhere to go. There was no money for gas, no home to return to. He had walked them to the edge of a cliff, and now he had led them right over it. He was trapped. He reached the sagging porch, his hand hesitating before touching the warped, splintered wood of the front door. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even properly closed. He gave it a push, and it swung inward with a long, agonizing groan that echoed in the unnatural silence. The darkness inside was almost total, and the stench of decay was 100 times worse, a physical presence that made him gag. A sliver of grey light filtered through the hole in the roof, illuminating a scene of absolute devastation. Rainwater had poured in for what must have been years, creating a black, creeping mold that crawled up the walls and across the floor in grotesque fractal patterns. A pile of sodden, unidentifiable debris lay in the center of the room, and he could hear the faint, frantic scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls. This wasn't a house. It was a wound, a festering, infected wound on the face of the earth, and he had just paid to crawl inside it with his child. The last embers of his hope were extinguished, leaving only the cold, black ash of regret. His eyes slowly adjusted, revealing the full scope of the nightmare. The main room was small, a single space that was meant to be a living area and kitchen combined. A rusty, cast-iron stove sat in one corner, its pipe disconnected and hanging limply from the ceiling. The floorboards were soft and spongy under his boots, clearly rotten through in several places. He could see daylight peeking through multiple gaps in the walls. There was no sink, no faucet, just a crude hole in the floor with a pipe leading to nowhere. No electricity, no running water. He had known that, but reading it in an ad was a sterile fact. Standing in the cold, damp reality, feeling the oppressive gloom, it was a terrifying sentence. He had brought his daughter, who was used to warm baths and cartoons on TV, to a place more primitive than a campsite. He felt a surge of self-loathing so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. What kind of father did this? What kind of man traded his child's safety for a fantasy born of desperation? Mia, who had been hiding behind him, peeked around his leg. He saw her small face register the darkness, the dirt, the terrifying emptiness of the place. Her lip began to tremble. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice filled with a fear that lanced straight through his heart. It's yucky here." She clung to his jeans, her small fingers digging into the fabric. Leo looked down at her clean pink jacket, now seeming absurdly out of place in this filth. He saw the trust in her eyes begin to curdle into confusion and fear. He had promised her an adventure, a magical house in the woods. Instead, he had brought her to a monster's den. The crushing weight of his failure pressed down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the precursor to a panic attack. The walls, covered in that creeping black mold, seemed to be closing in, the silence of the forest pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. He had gambled everything and lost in the most spectacular way imaginable. He scooped Mia up into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, as if he could shield her from the horror of his mistake with his own body. She buried her face in his neck, and he could feel her small, quiet sobs. He backed out of the cabin, away from the smell and the darkness, and stood in the weed-choked clearing, his daughter's tears soaking his shirt. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows that made the trees look like menacing giants. The air grew colder. He looked from the dilapidated ruin to his rusty truck, then at the endless, indifferent forest that surrounded them. There was no one for miles, no one to call, no one to help. He had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly alone. He had thought he had hit the bottom in that empty apartment in the city. He was wrong. The bottom was here, in this forgotten, rotting place, with his terrified child in his arms and $300 to his name. This wasn't the bottom. This was a grave he had dug for them both. The stark reality of their situation settled over him like a shroud. He had to make a choice, and quickly, spend his last dollars on gas to flee with no destination and no hope, or stay here, in this death trap, and try to carve out some semblance of shelter before night fell completely. His carpenter's mind, a part of him he thought had died, began to stir faintly. It assessed the damage, calculated the risks, the hole in the roof, the mold, the lack of water. It was an impossible task, but the image of Mia, sleeping in the truck on the side of some unknown road, was even more impossible to bear. Here, at least, there was a structure, however pathetic. Here there was a chance, however slim. He looked down at Mia's hair, smelling the faint scent of her strawberry shampoo, a scent from another life, a fierce, desperate resolve, born not of hope, but of sheer, animalistic parental instinct, began to push back against the despair. He would not let this place beat him. He had to make it work. He had no other choice. He carried Mia to the truck and sat her in the passenger seat, giving her the bag of chips and her worn-out coloring book. "You stay right here for a little bit, okay, sweetie? Daddy just needs to get our new house ready." He forced another smile, and this time she seemed to accept it, her attention shifting to the crinkling chip bag. Leo walked back to the cabin, but this time he didn't stop at the door. He went to the back of his truck and unlatched the heavy cases containing his tools. The familiar click of the latches was a comforting sound, a small anchor in a sea of chaos. He pulled out a heavy-duty crowbar and a large hammer, the worn wooden handles feeling solid and real in his grasp. These were the only things he had left that hadn't failed him. He walked back to the cabin, his steps more certain now. He wasn't a failure cowering in the dark anymore. He was a carpenter, and he had work to do. He jammed the crowbar against one of the rotten planks covering a window and threw his entire weight into it. The plank groaned in protest and then snapped with a loud crack, the sound echoing through the clearing. A rectangle of dusky orange light fell into the cabin's interior, cutting through the gloom. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He ripped away the other planks, one by one, letting in more light, more air. The musty smell began to dissipate, replaced by the crisp scent of the evening forest. He could see better now, and the task ahead seemed slightly less monumental, broken down into smaller, manageable pieces. First, a fire for warmth and to boil water. Second, clear a space on the floor away from the mold and the leak. Third, patch the hole in the roof with a tarp from his truck before the next rain. It was a brutal, desperate plan, but it was a plan. He felt a sliver of his old self returning, the problem solver, the builder. He was still terrified, still drowning in the consequences of his decision, but he was no longer paralyzed. The despair was still there, a cold, heavy stone in his gut, but now it had a purpose. It was fuel. He worked feverishly as the last light of day faded, his breath misting in the cold air. He found a relatively dry corner of the cabin and swept it clean with a broken branch, creating a small island of relative safety in the sea of filth. He dragged in their sleeping bags and duffel bags from the truck, trying to create a semblance of a camp. Mia watched him from the truck's window, her small face a pale oval in the growing darkness. The terror hadn't left him. It had simply settled into a low, constant hum beneath his actions. The isolation was still a physical weight, the silence of the forest still unnerving. He had brought them to the brink of disaster. But as he stood in the semi-darkness of the cabin he now owned, the hammer heavy in his hand, a new grim feeling took hold. This place had tried to break him. It had shown him the face of true hopelessness, but he was still standing. He was still a father, and the night was just beginning. He would not let this ruin be their tomb. He would make it their fortress, or he would die trying. The third night brought the sky down upon them. A furious storm raged, the wind screaming through the gaps in the cabin walls like a banshee. Thunder cracked directly overhead, each blast vibrating through the rotten floorboards and into Leo's bones. Rain didn't fall. It assaulted the patched-up roof, a relentless drumming that threatened to tear away the tarp he had so desperately secured. He and Mia were huddled in the driest corner, wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing they owned. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through their layers, making their teeth chatter. Mia was terrified, her face buried in his side, flinching with every roar of thunder. Leo held her tight, whispering reassurances he didn't feel, his own heart a frantic drum matching the storm's rhythm. He felt the cold seep of water through his jeans. The tarp wasn't holding. A steady drip, drip, drip began near their makeshift bed, each drop a tiny, mocking reminder of his failure to provide even the most basic shelter for his child. He was failing. It was in a brief lull between thunderclaps, when the wind's shriek momentarily softened to a low moan, that he heard it. A sound so out of place it felt like a hallucination. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the storm's fury, but it was there, a delicate, sorrowful melody, a lullaby. It seemed to be coming from above, a thin thread of music woven into the chaos of the night. He strained to hear it again, but a fresh gust of wind tore at the cabin and the sound was swallowed whole. He shook his head, blaming the exhaustion, the constant stress. It was the wind playing tricks, whistling through a strange knot in the wood, or a crack in the sealed-up attic hatch above them. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He pulled Mia closer, the scent of her hair a small comfort in the terrifying darkness. The sound, whatever it was, did not return. The storm raged on, and the memory of the phantom tune was soon buried under the more immediate concern of the spreading puddle on the floor. The following night was the opposite, a stark and unnerving contrast. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing in on the small cabin from all sides. There was no wind, no city hum, no distant traffic. Just the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl far away in the dense woods. Leo lay awake on his sleeping bag, his arm draped protectively over Mia, who was finally sleeping soundly. Exhausted by the previous night's terror, he stared up into the impenetrable darkness above, his mind racing. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. Every creak of the old cabin settling, every skittering sound from within the walls, was amplified into something menacing. He felt exposed, a tiny, vulnerable island of humanity in a vast, indifferent wilderness. His stomach grumbled with a hunger that had become a dull, constant ache. He had $240 left. The number echoed in the silence, a countdown to absolute zero, and then he heard it again. This time, there was no storm to mask it, no wind to blame. The lullaby. It was clear, impossibly clear, drifting down from the ceiling as if from a music box in the room just above. The melody was heartbreakingly sad, a simple, looping tune filled with a palpable sense of loss. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized him. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was not the wind, it wasn't an animal. The sound was melodic, structured, undeniably man-made, yet it had a ghostly, ethereal quality that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Mia. He held his breath, listening. The music continued its sorrowful loop, faint but distinct, seeming to emanate directly from the square outline of the sealed attic hatch on the ceiling. A wave of pure, primal fear washed over him. This rundown, forgotten place was not just empty. He and Mia were not alone here. There was something else, something that sang a song of grief in the dead of night. His rational mind, the carpenter's mind that believed in physics and solid matter, fought back against the terror. There had to be an explanation. A neighbor with a wind chime? He had seen no other houses for miles. A discarded toy with dying batteries. Perhaps. He slid silently out of his sleeping bag, his feet landing with a soft thud on the cold floorboards. The music continued, a ghostly metronome marking his movements. He had to find the source. He couldn't live here, couldn't let Mia sleep here, with this unsettling mystery hanging over their heads. He moved through the small space, his eyes scanning the dark corners, the debris-filled areas he hadn't yet cleared. Nothing. The sound was definitively coming from above. He stood directly under the attic hatch, a crude square of wood nailed shut over a hole in the ceiling. He tilted his head, listening. The lullaby was clearest here, a ghostly whisper seeping through the cracks around the sealed entrance, calling to him from the darkness above. He felt a knot of determination tighten in his gut, overriding the fear. He was a man of action, a builder and a fixer. He would not be haunted by ghost stories in his own home. He went to the corner where his tools lay, the worn metal and wood a comforting weight in the oppressive darkness. He selected a heavy crowbar, its cold steel feeling like an extension of his own will. He dragged a large, sturdy-looking wooden crate he'd found earlier and positioned it directly beneath the hatch. Climbing onto it, the rotten wood groaning under his weight, he could almost touch the ceiling. He ran his hand over the sealed hatch. It was made of thick planks, and long, rusty nails had been driven deep into the surrounding joists, pinning it shut with a sense of grim finality. This wasn't just closed, it was sealed, as if someone wanted to ensure that whatever was up there stayed up there, or that no one ever got in. The thought sent another chill down his spine, but he pushed it away. He had to know. He jammed the forked end of the crowbar into a thin gap between the hatch and the ceiling joist. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. The old wood moaned in protest, but it held firm. The rusty nails were deeply embedded. He repositioned the crowbar, finding a better angle, and threw his entire weight into it. A loud crack echoed through the silent cabin, followed by the screech of a nail being tortured from its ancient home. He felt a small victory. He worked methodically, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. One by one, he attacked the nails. The sounds of splintering wood and groaning metal filling the night. The lullaby had stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was somehow more unnerving than the ghostly music. It was as if the attic was holding its breath, waiting. Finally, with one last tremendous heave, the last nail gave way, and the heavy hatch swung downward on a single, creaking hinge, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness above. A wave of musty, stale air washed down over him, carrying the scent of decades of dust, decay, and forgotten things. It was a dry, choking smell, the smell of a sealed tomb. He coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. He held his small, powerful flashlight, one of the few valuable things he had left, and aimed its beam into the darkness. The light cut a sharp white cone through the black, illuminating a chaotic world of cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, hanging from ancient rafters. Dust motes, disturbed for the first time in generations, danced in the beam like a swarm of tiny insects. The attic was small, a lower frame space directly under the peak of the roof. It was filled with shadows and the ghostly shapes of discarded junk. An old, broken chair lay on its side. A stack of yellowed newspapers slumped in a corner. It was an attic like any other, filled with the detritus of lives lived long ago, but the oppressive feeling of watchfulness remained, thicker than the dust itself. He took a deep breath, the cold, stale air filling his lungs, and hauled himself up into the opening. The wooden frame of the hatch groaned under his weight, but it held. He swung his legs over and dropped onto the dusty floorboards of the attic, his boots landing with a soft thump that seemed shockingly loud in the stillness. He stood hunched under the low, slanted roof, sweeping the flashlight beam across the small space. The light caught the iridescent threads of a massive spiderweb, its creator frozen in the center. He saw mouse droppings, the remnants of ancient nests, and a thick layer of grime covering everything. There was no music box in plain sight, no obvious source for the sound he had heard. He felt a pang of disappointment, a flicker of doubt. Had he imagined it after all? Was he losing his mind, worn down by grief and stress? His light beam continued its slow journey, probing the dark corners, refusing to give up. The silence was absolute. The lullaby was gone. Then the beam landed on something in the far corner. It was a mound, a heap of what looked like old blankets or quilts, piled haphazardly against the wall. They were dark with age and rot, barely distinguishable from the shadows around them. A sense of unease pricked at him. There was something deliberate about the pile, something not quite right. It wasn't just tossed there. It looked like it was covering something. He moved cautiously towards it, his footsteps creaking on the old floorboards. The air in the corner was colder, the smell of mildew stronger. He reached out with the toe of his boot and nudged the edge of the pile. The fabric, rotten and heavy with dampness, fell apart at his touch, dissolving into a cloud of dust and fibers. Underneath, the flashlight beam revealed not more junk, but the flat, clean lines of the wooden floor. He crouched down, his heart beginning to beat a little faster, and brushed away the remaining debris with his hand, uncovering more of the floor. That's when he saw it. One of the floorboards was different from the others. While the surrounding planks were rough, splintered, and dark with age, this one was slightly cleaner, its edges sharper, and there was a small, crudely carved notch at one end, almost like a handle. It was a loose board. It was meant to be lifted. The mystery of the lullaby was forgotten, replaced by a new, more urgent question. Why? Why would someone go to the trouble of hiding a section of the attic floor? He felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind of excitement a treasure hunter must feel. He didn't have his crowbar, but the notch was just big enough to get his fingers into. He wedged his fingertips into the groove and pulled. It was heavy, but it lifted easily, without a single creak. It had been designed for quick, silent access. He lifted the board completely free and set it aside. His flashlight beam aimed into the dark cavity that was revealed beneath. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a large space, just a shallow hollow between the floor joists, but nestled inside, protected from the dust and rot of the attic, was a small, tin box. It was a simple, rectangular box, the kind that might have once held biscuits or tea. Its painted surface was faded and scratched, but it was otherwise intact, showing no signs of rust. It wasn't treasure, not gold or jewels, but it was something. It was the answer. This had to be the source of the mystery. He reached into the space, his fingers closing around the cold, smooth metal. The box was heavier than he expected. He lifted it out of its hiding place and set it on the floor in front of him. For a moment, he just stared at it, his flashlight beam creating a halo of light around it. The silence in the attic was deafening. He felt as if he had stumbled upon a secret that had been waiting for decades in the darkness, waiting for him. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the simple metal clasp on the front. With a small click, the clasp gave way. He lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was a small, ornate music box. Its dark wood polished to a soft sheen. It was exquisitely made, with delicate silver inlay around the edges. On the lid was a small brass winding key. On instinct, he turned it. A few clicks, and then the box sprang to life. The melody filled the attic. It was the lullaby, the same haunting, sorrowful tune he had heard in the night. It was crystal clear now, achingly beautiful, and filled with an almost unbearable sadness. So he wasn't crazy. It was real. But how had it played on its own? He looked closer and saw the mechanism was old and delicate. Perhaps a sudden change in temperature or a vibration from the storm had been enough to jolt the gears into motion for a few cycles. It was a plausible explanation, but it felt thin, insufficient to explain the chilling perfection of the moment he'd first heard it. The music felt less like a mechanical thing and more like a memory-given voice. He carefully lifted the music box out and set it aside. The melody continued to play, a lonely soundtrack to his discovery. Beneath it, the tin box held more secrets. There was a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting on the envelopes a graceful, feminine cursive. Next to the letters lay a photograph, its edges curled and its surface clouded. He picked it up and angled it in the flashlight beam. It showed a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. She was holding a bundled baby in her arms, looking down at the child with an expression of fierce, profound love. Even through the fading and discoloration, the emotion was powerful, a tangible thing that reached across the decades. Who was she? Was this her cabin? Was it her baby? He felt a pang of sadness. An intruder peering into a life he knew nothing about. A life that had clearly ended in sorrow if her secrets were hidden in the dark. The last item in the box was a formal-looking document, folded into a neat square. He carefully unfolded it, his carpenter's fingers, accustomed to rough materials, feeling clumsy and brutish with the delicate paper. It was a deed. The language was dense with legal jargon, but the key details were clear enough. It was a deed of ownership for this cabin and the surrounding 150 acres of land. Not 1.5 acres, as the online ad had claimed, but 150. The name on the deed was Elena Vance. He looked again at the photograph of the young woman, Elena. The name fit her face. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He had bought this property for $2,500, but this deed suggested it was part of a much larger, and likely much more valuable, parcel of land. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong here. He had stumbled into something far more complicated than a derelict cabin. He had stumbled into Elena's story. He picked up the bundle of letters. The ribbon crumbled in his fingers. He pulled out the top letter. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was clear. "My dearest child," the letter began. Leo's blood ran cold. These weren't just letters. They were a diary, written by this woman to the baby in the photograph. He began to read, his light tracing the elegant script. Elena wrote of her love for her baby and of her joy in this small cabin, a refuge she had built with her own hands. But as he read further, the tone shifted. Joy was replaced by a creeping, pervasive fear. She wrote of a man, a powerful man she was involved with, a man who wanted her land. He was charming, she wrote, but had a coldness in his eyes. She mentioned his ambitions and how her small plot of family land stood in his way. "He smiles and tells me he will take care of everything," she wrote in one entry. "But when he looks at my home, he does not see a home. He sees an obstacle. He looks at me and sees a complication. I feel his patience wearing thin. I am afraid. I am so afraid for us." Leo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the attic's cold. This was a story of love and betrayal, of a powerful man and a vulnerable woman. He scanned another letter, dated a few weeks after the first. Elena's fear had intensified into outright terror. "He knows about you now," she wrote to her child. "I thought it would soften his heart, but it has only made him harder, colder. He gave me a choice. Sign the papers, give him the land, and he will provide for you from a distance, or refuse. and he will not be responsible for what happens. He said it with a smile. But it was a threat. He spoke of how a single mother could have an accident out here, how a baby could disappear into the system. He wants to erase us. He wants my land, and he will stop at nothing to get it. Leo's hands were shaking. He was holding a confession, a motive. He was holding the story of a crime, hidden away for decades, waiting in the dark to be found. The music box continued its sad, tinny melody, a requiem for the woman who wrote these words. He read on, his horror growing with every line. The final letter was short, frantic, the handwriting jagged and hurried. He is coming tonight. I know it. He thinks I am a fool. I have hidden this box for you, my sweet child. If you are ever to read this, it means I have failed to protect you. Know that I love you more than the stars in the sky. Know that this land is yours by right, that it was stolen from us. Do not let him win. The music box was a gift to you, a song to remember me by. The deed is the proof. His name is Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance. The name hung in the dusty air, filled with menace. Leo felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just some historical tragedy. This was a murder. A powerful man named Arthur Vance had made a woman named Elena disappear to steal her land. And Leo was now standing in the middle of the crime scene, holding the evidence in his hands, decades after the fact. He felt as if the ghosts of the past had reached out and wrapped their cold fingers around his throat. He carefully placed the letters, the photo, and the deed back into the tin box, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering. A secret relationship, a hidden child, a fraudulent land grab, a disappearance that was almost certainly a murder, and a powerful man named Arthur Vance who had gotten away with it all. The lullaby from the music box finally wound down, its last note hanging in the oppressive silence before fading into nothing. The sudden quiet was jarring. Leo felt a new kind of fear, a cold, intelligent fear that was far worse than his supernatural dread. This wasn't a ghost he had to worry about. It was a man who had killed once to get what he wanted and who had been protecting his secret for 35 years. What would a man like that do if he found out that a widowed carpenter and his 7-year-old daughter had moved into his victim's cabin and unearthed his crime? The thought was paralyzing. He was no longer just a desperate father trying to survive. He was a witness. He snapped the lid of the tin box shut, the sound echoing in the small space. He had to get it out of here, get it somewhere safe. He carefully placed the box back into the hollow beneath the floorboard and fitted the plank back into place. He brushed some dust and debris over it, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. He couldn't leave it here forever, but for now, it was the only hiding spot he had. He backed away from the corner, his flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The attic no longer felt just old and dusty. It felt violated, a place of profound sadness and violence. He could almost picture Eleanor in this very spot, her hands shaking as she hid the box, her heart pounding with terror as she heard a car approaching on the dirt road. He was standing in her final moments, breathing the same air she breathed before her life was extinguished. The connection to her was visceral, terrifying. He had to get out. He had to get back to Mia. He scrambled back towards the hatch, his movements clumsy with haste. He dropped down onto the crate below, his feet hitting it with a loud thud. He didn't care about the noise anymore. He reached up and pushed the heavy hatch back into place. The darkness of the attic sealed away once more, but he knew it wasn't gone. The secret was still there, lurking in the dark. A silent bomb he had just discovered the timer for. He jumped down from the crate and stood in the middle of the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked over at Mia, a small, innocent lump under the sleeping bags. A wave of protective fury washed over him, so intense it almost choked him. He had brought her here to keep her safe, and instead he had led her into the heart of a dark and violent secret. The danger was no longer poverty or homelessness. It was a man named Arthur Vance, a man who had built a life on a foundation of lies and blood, and Leo had just found the first crack in that foundation. He stood there for a long time, the cold of the cabin seeping back into his bones. The initial adrenaline of the discovery was fading, replaced by a cold, hard dread. What was he supposed to do? Go to the police? He was a newcomer, a transient, living in a ruin. Arthur Vance, according to Elena's letters, was a powerful man. 35 years had passed. A man like that wouldn't still be a small-town lawyer. He would be entrenched, protected, his power absolute. They would never believe him. They would laugh him out of the station, or worse, they would make a phone call, and Arthur Vance would know that his secret was out. Leo looked around the derelict cabin, at the hole in the roof and the mold on the walls. He had no credibility. He had nothing but a box of old papers and a story that sounded like a work of fiction. To the outside world, he was just a desperate, grieving man on the edge of a breakdown. They might even use his precarious situation to take Mia away from him. The weight of the secret pressed down on him. He felt trapped, cornered by a ghost's plea for justice. If he did nothing, he would be living on stolen land, haunted by the knowledge of what happened here. Eleanor's story would remain buried, her killer unpunished, but if he did something, if he tried to expose the truth, he would be putting himself and, more importantly, his daughter, in the crosshairs of a ruthless man who had already proven he was capable of murder. He was a carpenter, not a detective. He was a father, not a hero. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong, but they felt useless now. He couldn't build his way out of this. He couldn't fix it with a hammer and nails. The silence of the night returned, heavy and suffocating. But it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken name of Arthur Vance and the faint, ghostly echo of a lullaby that was no longer a mystery, but a warning. He walked over to the corner and slid back into his sleeping bag, pulling its thin fabric up to his chin. He lay beside his daughter, listening to the soft, even rhythm of her breathing. She was the only thing that mattered. His fear for her was a physical thing, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He had stumbled into a war that had ended 35 years ago, and he was now the sole guardian of its most dangerous weapon. The tin box in the attic was more than just proof. It was a legacy of fear, a plea for help from a long-dead woman. By finding it, he had inadvertently picked up the torch. He felt the weight of Elena's last desperate hope settling onto his shoulders. Do not let him win. Her words from the letter echoed in his mind. It was a dying mother's plea to her child, but in the dark, silent cabin, it felt like a direct command to him. He didn't know who Arthur Vance was now, or how powerful he had become, but he knew one thing with chilling certainty. His desperate gamble to find a safe haven had failed. He had not found a refuge, he had found a tomb, and its secrets were now his to keep. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and indecision. Every option seemed to lead to a terrible outcome. Ignoring the discovery felt like a betrayal, a cowardly act that would leave Elena's spirit to haunt this land forever. Yet, acting on it felt like suicide, a direct challenge to a man who had already proven his ruthlessness. He was trapped between a ghost and a monster. The cabin, which just hours ago had been a symbol of his desperate failure, had transformed into something else entirely. It was a crime scene, a memorial, a hiding place for a truth that refused to stay buried. He felt a strange kinship with Eleanor, the woman who had loved this land and had fought to protect it. He too was fighting to protect his child, to build a safe world for her against impossible odds. The fight was the same, only the enemy had changed. Or perhaps it hadn't. Perhaps the monster who had destroyed Elena's life was the same kind of monster, a force of greed and power that had pushed him to this desperate edge in the first place. As dawn approached, painting the edges of the broken window frames with a faint old grey light, a fragile resolve began to form within him. He couldn't run. He had nowhere to run to, and no money to get there, and he couldn't ignore what he had found. It wouldn't let him. Elena's story had become his story. Her fight was now his fight. He didn't have a plan. He had no idea what his next move would be. But as he looked at Mia's peaceful, sleeping face, he knew he couldn't let fear make his decisions for him. He had been running from his grief, from his debts, from his failure, but he couldn't run from this. This was a line in the sand. He had to know more. He had to understand the scale of the monster he was facing. He would be careful. He would be smart. He would protect Mia at all costs, but he would not let Arthur Vance win. Not again. The mystery of the lullaby had been solved, but it had opened the door to a much larger and far more dangerous mystery, and Leo was standing right in the middle of it. With trembling hands, Leo smoothed out the first of Elena's letters on the rough wooden table. The flickering lantern light cast dancing shadows, making the graceful cursive seem to writhe on the page. His heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs as he read. The the words of a ghost whispering her terror across 35 years. "My darling Arthur," one of the earlier, happier letters began, "the city feels a world away when I am here with you. This land, my family's legacy, feels like our own secret kingdom." But the tone shifted dramatically in the next letter. The ink was darker, pressed harder into the page. "Arthur is no longer the man I fell in love with. He spoke today not of our future, but of his. He called this land underutilized, and spoke of mineral surveys and development contracts. There was a hunger in his eyes I had never seen before, a cold ambition that frightened me. He wants me to sell. He says it is for us, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. I felt a chill, a deep, unsettling cold, as if I were looking at a stranger. Leo felt the cabin's cold seep into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He picked up another letter, this one more frayed at the edges, as if it had been read and reread 100 times. "I told him about you today, my sweet child," Elena wrote, her script now a little less steady. "I thought the news of your existence would change him, would remind him of the love we shared. I was a fool. It was like showing a weakness to a predator." His face became a mask of stone. "He said your arrival complicates things. Complicates, as if you were a line item in a ledger. He presented me with documents, legal papers that would sign away my birthright for a pittance. He called it a generous offer to secure your future. He said he would set up a trust, that you would be cared for, but that we could never be a family. He wants to own this land, but he does not want us. The choice he gave me was no choice at all. Become a ghost in my own life, or be erased completely." His voice was so calm, so reasonable, but I heard the threat beneath it. The story unfolded, each letter a step deeper into a meticulously planned nightmare. Arthur Vance, the aspiring attorney, was no mere opportunist. He was a predator in waiting. The letters revealed that Elena's family had unknowingly owned land rich with valuable mineral deposits, a fact Vance had discovered through his legal connections. It was the foundation upon which he planned to build an empire. Elena and her unborn child were the only obstacles. "He knows I will never sell," a frantic entry read, the words nearly illegible. "This land is my blood, my mother's blood, my child's future. He cannot have it. Last night, he told me that accidents happen. He spoke of single mothers who fall, of fires that start in the night, of people who simply walk away from their lives and are never seen again. He detailed it all with the cold precision of a surgeon discussing an operation. He was not talking about possibilities. He was describing a plan. I saw my own death reflected in his cold, calculating eyes. I know now that he is capable of anything." Leo's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a profound, suffocating connection to the woman who had written these words in this very room. Likely by the light of a similar lantern, he was sitting in her tomb. The final letter, a single, tear-stained page, was her last will and testament. "He is coming tonight. I hear a car on the road. This box is my only legacy, my only voice. If you are reading this, my beloved child, know that I did not abandon you. I fought for you. This land, this rich earth is yours. The deed is the proof of your birthright. The music box is the song of my heart, a melody to remember me by when you cannot remember my face. His name is Arthur Vance. Do not let him win. Avenge me." Leo's hands shook so violently he could barely hold the paper. He could almost hear the crunch of tires on gravel, feel the spike of terror in Elena's heart. Vance had come for her, just as she had predicted. He had murdered her, hidden her body, and then fabricated a story that she had abandoned her baby, a story that allowed him to use fraudulent documents to seize her land. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Vance had stolen the land, exploited its mineral wealth, and built his fortune on the bones of the woman he claimed to love and the life of the child he had secretly sent away to an orphanage. A wave of nausea rolled through Leo. The sheer, calculated evil of it was breathtaking. He was not just a trespasser on stolen land. He was the keeper of a secret that could dismantle a powerful man's entire existence. 35 years. For 35 years, Arthur Vance had lived with this lie, his power and influence growing like a cancer, rooted in murder and deceit. Leo carefully folded the letters and placed them back in the tin box alongside the photograph of Elena and her baby. The weight of the box in his hands felt immense, heavier than any tool he had ever lifted. It was the weight of a life cut short, of a child's stolen legacy. of a justice that had been denied for decades. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was screaming. It was 2 days later, in the pale light of a Tuesday afternoon, when the modern world intruded. Leo was outside, trying to fashion a crude rain gutter from a piece of scrap metal he'd found, the rhythmic thump-thump of his hammer, the only sound in the clearing. Mia was nearby, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Then he heard it, a low, powerful hum, completely alien to the forest. It grew steadily louder. The sound of an expensive, well-tuned engine. His heart leaped into his throat. He instinctively looked at Mia, a surge of adrenaline sharpening his senses. He straightened up, hammer in hand, and watched the entrance to the dirt track. A moment later, a sleek black sedan, its paint gleaming even in the muted light, emerged from the trees. It moved with an arrogant slowness, its tires crunching on the gravel and mud as if they were insults to the rustic path. The car was so out of place it looked like a spaceship had landed. It rolled to a stop a few feet from his rusty pickup truck, a stark contrast between wealth and desperation. The engine cut off, and the ensuing silence was heavy and charged with tension. Leo's hand tightened on the hammer, the worn wood a familiar solid presence against his palm. He put himself between the car and Mia, a silent, protective stance. The driver's side door opened with a quiet, expensive-sounding click. A man emerged, unfolding himself from the car with a practiced, unhurried grace. He was in his late 60s, with a full head of perfectly coiffed silver hair. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Leo's truck. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, impossibly clean despite the muddy clearing. He stood for a moment, surveying the scene, the dilapidated cabin, the rusty truck, Leo in his dirt-stained clothes, with an expression that was both condescending and appraising. Then a warm, politician's smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were cold, pale blue, and sharp as chips of ice. It was the face of a man used to getting exactly what he wanted. "Leo, is it?" the man said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that carried easily across the clearing. It was the kind of voice that commanded attention, that was accustomed to being obeyed. He walked forward, extending a hand. His steps were measured, confident. Leo didn't move. He felt a primal wave of revulsion, a deep, instinctual recoiling. He was looking at Arthur Vance. He knew it with an absolute, bone-deep certainty. This was the man from the letters, older, more powerful, but the cold ambition Elena had described was still there, lurking just beneath the polished surface. The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second at Leo's immobility, before he let his hand drop smoothly to his side. "Forgive my intrusion," he continued, his tone never losing its practiced friendliness. "My name is Arthur Vance. I suppose you could say I'm your nearest neighbor, though my property is some ways down the road. I like to make a point of welcoming new folks to the area." The lie was so bald-faced, so effortless. It was terrifying. Vance's gaze drifted from Leo to the cabin, a flicker of something unreadable. Distaste, memory, passing through his cold eyes before the mask of affability snapped back into place. "Quite a project you've taken on here," he remarked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "This old place has been falling apart for decades. Frankly, I'm surprised someone had the courage to buy it." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding woods. "I'm the head of a local land trust, a forest preservation initiative. We've been acquiring these small abandoned plots for years, trying to return the area to its natural state, protect the watershed." Every word was a carefully polished stone, laid to build a foundation of lies. Leo felt his stomach twist into a tight knot. Forest preservation. The irony was so thick he could taste it, bitter as bile. This man hadn't preserved this land, he had plundered it, built a throne of corruption on its stolen resources, and was now feigning altruism to cover his tracks. Leo remained silent, letting the hammer in his hand speak for his distrust. Vance continued his monologue, his eyes now fixed on Mia, who had stopped her drawing and was watching him with a child's open curiosity. "A beautiful little girl," Vance said, his smile softening in a way that seemed grotesquely rehearsed. "It takes a brave man to raise a child on his own, especially out here." The words were meant to sound like a compliment, but they landed like a probe, a subtle gathering of information. He was assessing Leo's vulnerabilities, mapping out his weaknesses. Leo felt a spike of pure, white-hot rage, The audacity of this man, the murderer of one mother and the abandoner of his own child, to comment on his fatherhood was obscene. Leo took a half-step forward, his knuckles white around the hammer's handle. He wanted to scream the name Elena, to see the shock and fear on this monster's face, but he choked it down. An outburst would be a confession. It would be a death sentence. He had to play the game, even if it choked him. He forced a single, tight nod, a concession to the conversation. Vance took Leo's silence and nod as an opening. "Look, I'll be direct," he said, his tone shifting to one of brisk business. "My land trust was about to make a bid on this property when you bought it. We're still interested. I'm authorized to offer you $5,000 for the cabin and the plot. It's double what you paid. A nice little profit for your trouble. It would give you and your daughter a fresh start, somewhere safer, somewhere with 4 solid walls and running water." The offer hung in the air. A poisoned apple. It was a test. Vance was probing, trying to see if Leo was just a desperate fool who would jump at quick cash, or if he knew something, if he had a reason to hold on to this specific, worthless piece of land. Leo's mind raced. $5,000. It was a fortune to him right now. It was a ticket out of this nightmare. It was a path to safety for Mia. For a dizzying second, he was tempted. He could take the money, disappear, and leave the ghosts of the past behind. But then he saw Elena's face from the photograph, her eyes filled with love for her baby. He heard her last desperate plea, "Do not let him win." Taking the money would be the ultimate betrayal. It would be allowing Vance to buy his silence, to scrub the final traces of his crime from the earth for a paltry $5,000. It would be letting him win. Leo felt a strange calm settle over him, the cold clarity of a man with nothing left to lose. He had already hit the bottom. The only way was up or to go down fighting. "I'm not interested in selling," Leo said, his voice low and steady, surprising even himself. "I'm a carpenter. I like a project." For the first time, Vance's mask slipped completely. The folksy charm vanished, instantly replaced by an ice-cold fury. His eyes narrowed, and the skin around his mouth tightened. It was a look of pure, predatory anger. The look Elena must have seen in her final moments. The friendly neighbor was gone, and the monster was here. "Don't be a fool," Vance hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He took a step closer, invading Leo's personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne was sickeningly sweet. "This place is a death trap. Look at it. Black mold, a collapsed roof, no sanitation. You think this is a suitable home for a child?" He didn't wait for an answer. His eyes flicked toward Mia again, and his voice became smooth as silk, but woven with threads of pure steel. "You know, I have friends, good people, who work at Child Protective Services. They take their jobs very seriously. They have a duty to investigate reports of children living in unsafe, neglectful conditions." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the table. A gleaming knife pointed directly at Leo's heart. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. Neglectful, unsafe. He was weaponizing Leo's poverty, his desperation, his love for his daughter, turning it all against him. A cold dread, more profound than any fear he had felt before, washed over Leo. He felt paralyzed. Vance had him in a perfect trap. If he stayed, he risked Vance's wrath. If he fought back, he risked having Mia torn away from him by a corrupt system Vance controlled. He could picture it all. The official-looking cars, the strangers with sad eyes taking Mia by the hand, her terrified face looking back at him as they drove away. The image shattered him. The hammer felt impossibly heavy in his suddenly nerveless hand. Vance saw the terror in his eyes and knew he had won this round. A thin, cruel smile touched his lips. "You're a struggling father," he said, the false sympathy returning to his voice, now more menacing than his anger. "The system can be very hard on men in your position. It would be a tragedy if a misunderstanding were to separate you from your lovely daughter." He let the words sink in, then turned and walked back toward his car with the same unhurried, confident stride. Vance paused with his hand on the car door, looking back at Leo over his shoulder. "I'm a reasonable man. I'll leave the offer on the table for a few days. Think about it. Think about what's best for your little girl." He got into the car, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud that sealed Leo inside his nightmare. The engine started, and the black sedan reversed, turned, and disappeared back into the trees, leaving behind only the scent of exhaust and the oppressive, ringing silence. Leo stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tin box in the attic was a stick of dynamite, and Judge Arthur Vance had just threatened to light the fuse. He was trapped between honoring a dead woman's plea for justice and protecting his living daughter from a monster who held all the power. The choice felt impossible, a decision between two different kinds of devastation. What would you do in Leo's place? Would you surrender the secret and run, or would you risk your child's safety to fight for a justice that might be impossible to win? The black sedan was gone, but its presence lingered like a toxic chemical spill in the clearing. The air, which moments before had smelled of pine and damp earth, now seemed tainted with the cloying scent of Vance's cologne and the acrid odor of his threats. Leo stood rooted to the spot, the hammer feeling like a useless toy in his hand. His mind was a maelstrom of terror and rage. Vance's words echoed, a cruel litany of his vulnerabilities, the mold, the lack of water, his status as a struggling single father. Each word had been a precision strike, expertly aimed at his deepest fears. He felt his knees weaken, the strength draining from his body, replaced by a cold, liquid dread that pooled in his stomach. The man hadn't just threatened him, he had dissected him, laid his soul bare, and promised to destroy the only thing Leo had left in the world. He looked at the cabin, his supposed refuge, and saw it now through Vance's eyes. A cage of his own making, a perfect exhibit for the agents of Child Protective Services. He felt utterly, hopelessly trapped. Mia, oblivious to the monstrous exchange that had just occurred, ran towards him, holding up a dirty rock that she had decided was a diamond. "Look, Daddy, we're rich," she squealed, her face beaming with innocent joy. The sound, which usually was the anchor of his sanity, was now a spike of pure agony in his heart. He forced a smile that felt like a facial wound, his lips cracking with the effort. He knelt and took the rock, his hand trembling. "It's beautiful, sweetie. The most beautiful diamond in the world." The lie was a shard of glass in his throat. All he could see was Vance's cold, reptilian gaze on his daughter. All he could hear was the silky menace in his voice. He had brought her here to protect her, but he had instead placed her directly in the path of a monster, using her as a shield while he wrestled with the ghosts of the past. The self-loathing that washed over him was so intense it made him dizzy. He was no better than Vance, sacrificing his child for a principle, for a dead woman's plea for justice. The thought was unbearable. He needed to get her inside, away from the watchful eyes of the forest, away from the lingering ghost of Arthur Vance. He scooped Mia into his arms, holding her so tightly she squirmed in protest. "Let's go in, kiddo, it's getting chilly," he said, his voice strained and hoarse. He carried her over the threshold of the dilapidated cabin, the rotting wood groaning under their combined weight. Inside, the gloom seemed to have deepened, the shadows in the corners stretching out like grasping fingers. The small space, which he had begun to see as a testament to his resilience, now felt like a prison cell. He was a rat in a maze designed by a sociopath, and every turn led to a dead end. Stay, and Vance would take Mia. Run, and he would prove Vance's point that he was an unfit father, unable to provide a stable home. He felt the walls closing in, the air thick and hard to breathe. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his chest, a frantic bird beating its wings against his ribs. He had to think. He had to find a way out. His gaze fell upon the corner where he kept his tools, and his eyes darted upwards to the ceiling. The attic, the box, the entire nightmare was contained in that small tin vessel, the source of his danger, but also his only conceivable weapon. A desperate, wild idea began to form in his mind. He couldn't fight Vance through his own corrupt system. He couldn't win a legal battle, but evidence, hard, irrefutable evidence from a victim's own hand, that had a power of its own. It was a language that even monsters understood. After he put Mia to bed for a nap, her innocent breathing a stark contrast to the violent turmoil in his heart, he climbed onto the crate, his movements swift and silent. He pried open the loose floorboard, the motion now familiar, and pulled out the tin box. He didn't open it, he just held it, its cold metal a conduit to the past. He could feel Elena's fear, her desperation, her final defiant act. He was no longer just a carpenter. He was a custodian. This box was his responsibility now, a sacred trust. He would not let her down. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, menacing shadows across the clearing, Leo sat on the sagging porch, the tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard inside the cabin. His mind was a battlefield. He rehearsed the confrontation with Vance over and over, each replay making him feel more powerless. The man's confidence, his utter lack of fear, was what terrified Leo the most. This was a predator who had been hunting in these woods for a very long time. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple, a beautiful spectacle that felt like a mockery of his inner turmoil. The forest, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, now seemed hostile, its deep shadows capable of hiding any number of threats. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a prey animal, acutely aware that a predator was circling. He strained his ears, listening for the low hum of that black sedan, his body coiled tight as a spring, ready to fight or to flee. He heard a sound, but it wasn't a car. It was the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry leaves and twigs, coming not from the road, but from the dense woods bordering the clearing. Leo shot to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed the heavy hammer he now kept constantly by his side, his knuckles turning white. He squinted into the deepening twilight, trying to pierce the gloom beneath the trees. A figure emerged, slowly, cautiously, from the shadows. It was not one of Vance's men. It was an old man, stooped with age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He wore simple, durable work clothes and carried a long walking stick. He stopped at the edge of the tree line, his faded blue eyes wary, assessing. He looked at Leo, at the hammer in his hand, and then his gaze moved past him to the cabin. There was no malice in his face, only a deep, profound sadness and a weariness that seemed to seep from his very bones. He looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for a very long time. "Saw the fancy car leave a while ago," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, like stones tumbling in a dry riverbed. "Figured he'd find his way here sooner or later. That man's got a nose for trouble, and an even better one for things that don't belong to him." He took a few more slow steps into the clearing, his eyes never leaving Leo's. He wasn't armed, and his movements were slow, deliberate, signaling he was no threat. Still, Leo's grip on the hammer didn't loosen. In this place, trust was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. "I'm Samuel," the old man said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Lived down this road since I was a boy. Longer than anyone, longer than him." He jabbed a thumb in the direction Vance's car had disappeared. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions. Leo could feel the old man's gaze on him, a probing, intelligent look that was searching for something. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the unearthing of old ghosts. Just then, Mia, awakened from her nap by the silence, appeared in the cabin doorway, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She looked from Leo to the strange old man, her expression one of pure, childish curiosity. Samuel's breath caught in an audible gasp. The wary, guarded expression on his face dissolved, replaced by one of stunned, almost painful recognition. He stared at Mia, his faded eyes wide with disbelief. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. It's uncanny." He took a half-step forward, his gaze fixed on Mia's face, on the shape of her eyes and the curve of her mouth. "She has her eyes," he murmured, more to himself than to Leo. "She has Elena's eyes." The name, spoken aloud in the clearing for the first time by someone other than himself, struck Leo like a physical blow. The hammer suddenly felt impossibly heavy in his hand. This old man, this stranger from the woods, knew. He knew Elena. The secret Leo had unearthed was not a secret at all. It was a memory, alive and breathing in this old man's mind. Leo's defenses crumbled, replaced by a desperate, fragile hope. He lowered the hammer. "You knew her?" he asked, his own voice sounding hollow and strange in the quiet clearing. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes still on Mia, a universe of sorrow and memory contained in his gaze. "Knew her. I watched her grow up. My family worked this land for her family for 2 generations. I was just a young farmhand, but she was kind. She didn't see me as just a worker. She saw me. She used to bring me water on hot days. She'd sit and talk about her dreams for this place. His voice cracked with an ancient grief, the pain of a loss that 35 years had failed to dull. He finally tore his eyes away from Mia and looked at Leo, a deep understanding passing between them. "He was here today, wasn't he, Arthur Vance? He threatened you, I can see it on your face. He has the same look he had back then, the look of a wolf circling a lamb." This man didn't just know the story, he had been a part of it. Samuel's gaze was intense, searching. He wouldn't be here, not after all this time, unless something spooked him, unless something from the past resurfaced. He looked pointedly at the cabin, at the disturbed dust and the newly cleared porch. This place holds memories. Some of them refuse to stay buried. Leo felt a decision solidify within him. He was out of options, cornered by a man with limitless power. This old man, this guardian of Elena's memory, was his only hope, a lifeline thrown to him from the past. "I found something," Leo said, his voice low. "In the attic, a tin box." Samuel's eyes widened, and he took a sharp breath. "The box?" he whispered, the words full of awe and dread. "She told me she was hiding it. She told me it was for her child. Proof. So it survived. All this time, it was right here." He looked at Leo with a newfound respect, a shared purpose. "You need to come with me, not here. It isn't safe to talk here. He has eyes everywhere. We'll go to my place, now, before it gets fully dark." The walk to Samuel's cottage was a tense, silent journey of a mile down the dark and winding dirt road. Leo carried Mia, who had fallen back asleep, her small body a warm, precious weight against his chest. Samuel led the way, his walking stick thumping a steady, rhythmic beat against the hard-packed earth. He moved with a quiet familiarity, navigating the ruts and stones in the near-total darkness with an ease born of a lifetime of habit. The woods pressed in on them, the air growing colder, thick with the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. The silence was profound, broken only by their footsteps and the distant hoot of an owl. Leo felt as if they were moving through a tunnel, not just of trees, but of time, heading deeper into the heart of a story that had begun long before he was born. The fear was still a cold knot in his gut, but it was now mingled with a sliver of something else. Agency. He was no longer just reacting. He was moving toward an alliance, toward a truth more powerful than Vance's lies. Samuel's home was the antithesis of Leo's cabin. It was small and humble, but it was a place of warmth and life. A thin plume of wood smoke rose from a stone chimney, and a soft yellow light glowed from the windows. Inside, it smelled of pipe tobacco, old books, and beeswax. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on walls lined with overflowing bookshelves. It was the home of a man who had retreated from the world, but had built a rich one for himself within his own four walls. Samuel motioned for Leo to place the sleeping Mia on a comfortable, well-worn couch, and he gently covered her with a thick, hand-stitched quilt. He moved with a quiet tenderness that touched Leo deeply. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Leo felt a flicker of safety, a small island of calm in the storm of the past few days. He sat in a sturdy wooden chair by the fire, the warmth seeping into his chilled bones, and he finally let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Samuel poured them both a cup of steaming, black coffee, his hands gnarled but steady. He sat opposite Leo, the firelight carving deep shadows into the lines on his face. "I was in love with her, you know," he began, his voice soft, the gravelly rasp smoothed by the quiet intimacy of the room. "Elena. I was just a poor farm boy, and she was the landowner's daughter, but it didn't matter. Not to her, she was light. That's the only word for it. And he," Samuel's face darkened, "Vance, he was a shadow, a charming one. At first, a city lawyer with big dreams who swept her off her feet. I saw the darkness in him from the beginning, the way he looked at this land, not with love, but with greed, like a thing to be conquered, to be consumed." He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes focused on the flames, lost in a memory that was as vivid as yesterday. She knew it too. In the end, she was terrified of him. She told me he would kill her to get what he wanted. The old man's voice dropped to a near whisper, heavy with a guilt that had festered for 35 years. "The night she vanished, I was checking my traps in the woods. I couldn't sleep. I had a bad feeling, a cold dread I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I saw the headlights of his car leaving the track from her cabin. He drove fast, recklessly. I knew, in my gut, I knew something terrible had happened. I should have gone to the police. I should have shouted it from the rooftops. His voice broke, and he looked down at his gnarled hands, clenched into tight fists in his lap. But I was a coward. I was a 20-year-old boy, and he was already connected, already powerful. His family had judges and politicians in their pocket even back then. I knew what would happen to me. An accident, a disappearance. So I said nothing. I buried what I saw, and I have lived with the shame of my silence every single day since. His confession hung in the air, a raw, painful truth that explained his reclusive life, his haunted eyes. Leo pushed the tin box, which he had carried under his coat, across the small table toward Samuel. "She left this," he said quietly, "for her child." Samuel reached out a trembling hand and traced the faded paint on the lid. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. "Her final move," he breathed, a look of awe on his face. She was always smarter than he gave her credit for. He looked up at Leo, his eyes locking with a new intensity. "But you don't understand the full truth, do you? You have the motive of their love affair, but you don't have the real motive. Vance didn't just want the land for development, he wanted it for what was under it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower, charged with the energy of a secret held for a lifetime. Old Man Hemlock, Eleanor's grandfather, was a prospector in his youth. He always claimed this ridge was full of something valuable. Everyone thought he was a crazy old coot, but he wasn't. Just before he died, he showed me his survey maps. He'd found one of the richest lithium deposits in the state. The word hung in the air. Lithium. Not just timber or farmland. The white gold of the modern era, the lifeblood of batteries, of technology, of a multi-billion-dollar industry. Leo's mind struggled to comprehend the scale of it. "Vance knew," Leo whispered, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying finality. "He must have found out through his legal work." Baby saw the old surveys. Samuel nodded grimly. "Exactly. He seduced Elena to get close to the property. Her love was a tool, her child a complication. The murder wasn't just a crime of passion or greed. It was the founding act of an empire. Every dollar Vance has, every politician he owns, every judge in his pocket, it all grew from a seed of lithium-rich dirt, watered with Elena's blood. His entire fortune is a lie, built on this one single act of violence. He didn't just steal a farm, he stole a source of generational wealth that would be worth billions in today's market. That's why he's so terrified of this cabin. It's not about the memory, it's about the loose thread that could unravel everything." A new, staggering thought struck Leo. "The heir," he said, his voice barely audible. "Elena's child, the one she wrote the letters to." Samuel's expression softened, but the sadness in his eyes deepened. "Yes, the rightful heir to all of it. Vance couldn't bring himself to kill his own baby, but he couldn't let her exist either. He had a corrupt doctor fake a death certificate and used a shady adoption agency to send her 1,000 miles away. I spent years trying to track her, using what little money I had. I found her about 10 years ago. She's a woman now, about 36 years old, a schoolteacher in Oregon. She has no idea. She grew up an orphan, believing her mother abandoned her. She has no idea that she is one of the wealthiest people in the country, or that her father is the monster who destroyed her life before it even began." The injustice of it all was a physical weight, pressing the air from Leo's lungs. This wasn't just about avenging a murder, it was about restoring a life, a legacy. Leo stared into the fire, his mind reeling from the sheer scale of Vance's evil. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. It was a story of Shakespearean betrayal, of stolen empires and lost princesses. He felt like a bit player who had accidentally wandered onto the main stage in the final act. Samuel seemed to read his thoughts. "Finding that box. You didn't just find a secret, son. You found a key that could unlock all of it. Justice for Elena, a life for her daughter, and the end of Arthur Vance." The old man's voice was filled with a new fire, the fire of a man who sees a chance to atone for a lifetime of silence. "I was a coward once," he said, his voice hard as iron. "I will not be a coward again. I will not let him do to you and your little girl what he did to Elena. I will stand with you. We will find a way." For the first time, Leo didn't feel alone. He had an ally, a guardian of the story. a man whose guilt had been forged into a weapon of righteous fury. Hope, real and powerful, ignited in his chest. The next 24 hours were a blur of tense planning. Samuel, it turned out, was more than just a reclusive old man. His guilt had driven him to become a meticulous, albeit secret as chronicler of Vance's empire. He had maps, articles, and financial records he'd been collecting for decades, all pointing to the corruption that stemmed from the original land grab. They laid out a desperate plan. The local police were useless, all in Vance's pocket. They needed to go bigger, to a level of authority Vance couldn't control. Samuel knew of a state-level investigative journalist, a woman with a reputation for taking down corrupt politicians. She was their only shot, but they needed to get to her. Samuel drew a crude map on a piece of paper, showing a hidden trail that snaked through the woods from the back of Leo's cabin to his own property, a path that was invisible from the main road. "If he sends men, they'll come from the front," Samuel said, his finger tracing the path. "You run out the back. Don't hesitate, just run. Get to me, and we make the call." The ultimatum came not as a visit, but as a single, chilling text message to the cheap burner phone Samuel had given him. It appeared just after noon the next day, a message from an unknown number. The words were simple, brutal, and utterly terrifying. 5 p.m. Take the money. A car will be at the end of the road. Leave the key in the cabin. If you are still there at 5:01, I make the call. Your daughter will be in state custody by morning. Don't test me. Leo's blood ran cold. The casual cruelty, the absolute certainty of the threat, was paralyzing. He showed the phone to Samuel, his hand shaking. The old man's face hardened. "He's not bluffing," Samuel said grimly. "He's a cornered animal, and he's decided to go for the throat. We don't wait for 5 o'clock. They'll come for the box tonight, whether you leave or not. He can't risk you taking it with you." The plan was no longer a contingency. It was a certainty. Tonight, the ghosts of the past would clash with the present, and Leo and Mia would be caught in the middle. Leo spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of hypervigilance. He tried to act normal for Mia, playing games with her, reading her stories, his voice a tight, strained instrument. Every sound from the forest made him jump. The wind in the trees sounded like whispers. The snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. He felt as if he were living in the last few moments before an explosion, the air thick with an unbearable tension. He packed a small, durable backpack. Inside, wrapped in an oilskin cloth Samuel had given him, was the tin box. He added a bottle of water, the last of their crackers, and Mia's favorite worn teddy bear. Everything else was expendable. The tools he had cherished, the clothes, the sleeping bags, they were just things. Only Mia and the box mattered. Only their escape mattered. As dusk fell, painting the sky in angry streaks of red, a profound and terrifying silence descended upon the clearing. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence before the storm. He didn't have to wait long. An hour after the sun had fully set, he heard it, not a car on the road, but something more stealthy, the crunch of multiple footsteps in the dry underbrush, coming from the woods. They were trying to be quiet, but their clumsy movements were loud as gunshots in the oppressive stillness. Leo's heart leaped into his throat. He peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. He could just make out two large, dark shapes moving at the edge of the clearing. They were not police officers or CPS agents. They were thugs sent to do Vance's dirty work, to retrieve the evidence and silence its keeper. He grabbed the backpack and slung it over his shoulders, his movements practiced from hours of mental rehearsal. He gently shook Mia awake. "Hey, sleepyhead," he whispered, his voice miraculously calm. "Time for a new adventure, a night hike." "It's a secret." Mia, groggy and confused, just nodded, trusting him completely. That trust was a blade in his heart. He heard a metallic scraping at the front door as one of the men tried to pick the cheap lock he had installed. It was followed by a grunt of frustration and a loud splintering kick. The flimsy door shuddered in its frame but held. Leo backed away from the door, pulling Mia with him towards the rear of the cabin. His heart was a wild drum against his ribs. He could hear the men whispering angrily outside. "Just break it down," one of them hissed. A second, more powerful kick slammed against the door, and the frame began to splinter. They would be inside in seconds. He had to go. Now. He moved to the small window at the back of the cabin, the predetermined escape route. He held Mia tight against his hip. her small arms wrapped around his neck. "Hold on tight, sweetie," he whispered, his lips against her hair. "This is the fast part." He looked out the grimy window into the impenetrable blackness of the forest. It was a terrifying void, but the real monsters were behind him. Then, a new sharp, chemical smell filled the air. Gasoline. Leo's blood ran cold. He heard a sloshing sound, followed by the scrape of a match and a sudden, violent whoosh. An unnatural orange light instantly flooded the cabin, casting flickering, demonic shadows on the walls. The front porch was on fire. They weren't just trying to get in anymore. They were trying to burn him out, to destroy the cabin and everything in it, including the evidence and anyone who knew about it. The heat was immediate, intense. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to pour through the cracks around the door. Mia started to cough, her eyes wide with terror. There were no more choices. There was no more time. The fire was the starting gun. With a surge of desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength, Leo swung the heavy iron hammer he held in his free hand. He smashed it against the rear window. The glass didn't just break. It exploded outwards in a shower of glittering shards, the sound deafening in the small cabin. Without a second's hesitation, Leo scrambled through the empty window frame, shielding Mia's head with his arm. He landed awkwardly on the damp ground outside, his ankle twisting painfully, but he didn't cry out. He ignored the sharp searing pain and pushed himself to his feet. Behind him, the roar of the fire was growing louder, the orange glow lighting up the clearing like a scene from hell. He could hear the men shouting, realizing what he had done. He didn't look back. He plunged headlong into the darkness of the forest, away from the fire and the shouting, guided only by the memory of the map Samuel had drawn. The branches of unseen trees whipped at his face, scratching his skin. His lungs burned, not just from the exertion, but from the acrid smoke and the sheer, overwhelming terror. He ran blindly, stumbling over roots, his daughter clinging to him like a limpet, her frightened sobs lost in the sound of his own ragged breathing and the thundering of his heart. He was running on pure instinct now, a father animal fleeing with his young. The forest was a maze of blackness, every tree a potential obstacle, every shadow a potential enemy. The pain in his ankle was a sharp, insistent throbbing, but he forced it from his mind. He had to find the trail, Samuel's trail. It was his only hope. He could hear the men crashing through the woods behind him, their heavy footsteps getting closer. They were faster, unburdened. A wave of panic threatened to overwhelm him, to make him fall, to make him give up. But then he felt Mia's small hand clutch a fistful of his shirt, her knuckles pressing into his chest. It was a tiny, desperate gesture, a silent plea. It was the only thing that mattered. It was the fuel that drove him forward. He pushed harder, faster, his legs pumping, his lungs screaming, diving deeper into the cold, unforgiving darkness, with the roar of the fire behind him and the sound of his hunters closing in. He was no longer a carpenter or a victim. He was a force of nature, a father fighting for his child's life. Leo burst from the tree line like an animal flushed from its burrow, his lungs on fire, the pain in his ankle a white-hot scream. He saw the warm, yellow light of Samuel's cottage and stumbled toward it, a drowning man reaching for a life raft. Samuel was there, his silhouette framed in the doorway, and he pulled them inside with surprising strength, slamming the heavy wooden door behind them. The sharp, satisfying thud of the iron bolt sliding home was the most beautiful sound Leo had ever heard. It was the sound of a sanctuary sealed against the horrors of the night. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old paper, a world away from the acrid stench of gasoline and burning pine that clung to their clothes. Leo slid to the floor, his back against the door, his chest heaving as he held a still sobbing Mia. He looked at her tear-streaked face, smudged with dirt and terror, and his own tears finally came, silent drops of pure relief and exhaustion. The distant, angry glow of the fire was a fading memory. While Leo tended to a terrified Mia, wrapping her in the quilt and whispering that the scary game was over, Samuel moved with an electrifying urgency that defied his age. He went to a dusty, black rotary phone in the corner, an antique from another era. He dialed a number from memory, his gnarled finger pulling the wheel with steady, deliberate clicks. The connection was made. "Sarah, it's Samuel." He spoke in a low, urgent rasp, his voice stripped of all pleasantries. "I'm calling it in. The story we talked about. It's happening now. I have a man and his child here. They were just burned out of the old Vance cabin. He has it. Sarah. He has the proof. Letters. A deed. Everything. But Vance knows. He sent men. We have until dawn. Maybe less. He listened, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Leo. Understood. He hung up the phone. There's a truck stop 50 miles south of here. A journalist I trust, Sarah Jenkins. She'll meet us there in 3 hours. We have to go now, before the roads are watched. The pre-dawn air at the truck stop was cold and smelled of diesel fuel and stale coffee. They sat in a corner booth, the cracked red vinyl cold beneath them. Mia was asleep in Leo's lap. Sarah Jenkins arrived looking exactly like her reputation. Sharp, intelligent, and radiating an aura of no-nonsense skepticism. Her eyes, tired but incredibly focused, took in Leo's haggard appearance, his bruised face, and the sleeping child. Leo, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and smoke, felt a tremor of doubt. But then he unzipped the backpack and placed the old tin box on the sticky Formica tabletop. The sound it made was small, but it landed with the weight of a gravestone. He opened it. He pushed the yellowed letters, the faded photograph of Elena and her child, and the brittle deed toward the journalist. He told her everything, his voice cracking as he recounted the lullaby, the threats, and the fire. Samuel sat beside him, a silent, grim statue, ready to give his own testimony, a truth he had carried for a lifetime. Sarah Jenkins picked up the first letter, her long fingers surprisingly gentle with the fragile paper. As she read, her professional skepticism visibly dissolved, replaced by a focused, chilling intensity. She read Elena's words of love, then her creeping fear, and finally, her absolute terror. The journalist's face, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner, hardened into a mask of cold fury. She looked from the photograph of the young mother to the sleeping Mia. Seeing the ghost of a resemblance Samuel had seen, this was not just a story, it was a resurrection. She pulled a slim laptop from her bag and began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing names, dates, and property records. She recorded Samuel's eyewitness statement on her phone, his gravelly voice lending an unshakable gravity to the horrific tale. "Judge Arthur Vance," she said softly, the name tasting like poison. "I knew it. I always knew there was something rotten at the heart of his empire." The power of a state-level investigation, when spurred by a reporter of Sarah Jenkins's caliber and armed with irrefutable evidence, was a sight to behold. It bypassed Vance's entire local network of corrupt sheriffs and bought-off officials. Working directly with a trusted contact in the state attorney general's office, Sarah transmitted the evidence, scanned copies of Elena's letters, the deed, and Samuel's sworn trials recorded testimony were enough to light a firestorm. Within hours, warrants were issued not by a local court, but by a state judge. A fleet of unmarked state police vehicles descended on the county, a silent, professional force that Vance's cronies were powerless to stop. The system he had so expertly manipulated for 35 years had turned against him, moving with a speed and force he could have never anticipated. The law, the real law, was coming for him, and there was nowhere left for him to hide, no one left to call for protection. The foundation of his bloody empire was cracking. The arrest was the lead story on every news channel by noon. Leo, Mia, and Samuel watched from the sterile safety of a state-provided hotel room. There he was, Judge Arthur Vance, the man of untouchable power and tailored suits, being led from his palatial estate in handcuffs. The mask of calm affability was gone, replaced by a contorted snarl of pure, impotent rage. He shouted at the cameras, his words of denial drowned out by the storm of reporters' questions. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Judge arrested in decades-old murder plot. Billion-dollar fortune built on blood and lies. His empire of corruption, built on a single, violent act of greed, was being dismantled piece by piece on live television. Leo looked at Mia, who was happily coloring on the floor, oblivious to the drama on the screen. He felt a wave of surreal vindication wash over him, a deep, shuddering release of a tension he had carried for what felt like a lifetime. The monster was finally in a cage. Justice under for Elena was beginning. Guided by Samuel's decades-old research and information from the adoption agency records unsealed by the investigation, Authorities located Elena's daughter within days. Her name was Anna, a quiet, ill-beloved third-grade teacher living in a small town in Oregon. The news shattered her world, the life she had known. The story of an orphan abandoned by an unknown mother was a lie. She was flown to meet Leo and Samuel, a whirlwind of grief and disbelief swirling around her. In the quiet of a lawyer's office, Leo gave her the tin box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. She picked up the small music box and, with a deep breath, turned the key. The sad, haunting lullaby filled the room. It was the first and only thing she would ever share with her mother. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the photograph of the vibrant young woman holding her as a baby, an image of a love she had been denied her entire life. She looked at Leo, her eyes filled with a gratitude so immense no words were needed. Anna, the bewildered schoolteacher who was now the sole heir to a vast, legitimate fortune, acted with a swiftness and clarity that would have made her mother proud. She had no interest in the empire built on her mother's murder, but she felt a deep responsibility to honor the sacrifice that had been made. In a meeting with her new team of lawyers, she made her intentions clear. A legal document was drawn up. With a steady hand, Anna signed the deed to the cabin, but not for the derelict 1.5 acres Leo had bought. She signed over a deed for the cabin and 2 full surrounding acres of woods and meadowland free and clear, directly to Leo. Furthermore, she established a trust in his and Mia's name, a sum of money so significant that it wiped away every last cent of his debt and guaranteed that neither he nor his daughter would ever have to worry about money again. "You gave me back my mother," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the truth. Let me give you back your future." 6 months later, the sun streamed through the new, custom-built windows of the cabin. The air no longer smelled of rot and decay, but of freshly brewed coffee, sawdust, and the sweet scent of honeysuckle growing on a new trellis. The structure was transformed, a testament to a carpenter's love and skill. The collapsed roof was replaced with sturdy new beams, the walls were sound, and a wide, welcoming porch wrapped around the front. Leo sat on that porch in a rocking chair he had built, not with a hammer for defense, but with a piece of fine grit sandpaper. He was lovingly smoothing the curve of a hand-carved wooden bird, his hands steady and sure. The gaunt, haunted look was gone from his face, replaced by a quiet, deep-seated peace. His shoulders were no longer hunched with the weight of despair, but were relaxed and strong. The calluses on his hands were from the joyful work of creation, not the desperate struggle for survival. He was home. He was whole. He was finally, truly, safe. He looked up from his work and smiled. Across the lush green lawn, where weeds and mud once dominated, Mia was playing, her bright laughter echoing in the warm afternoon air. It was a sound of pure, untroubled happiness, a melody that had completely replaced the ghostly lullaby that once haunted the clearing. Leo took a deep breath, feeling the clean mountain air fill his lungs. He was a free man on his own land. His daughter was safe and their future was bright. He had faced the absolute bottom and had chosen to fight, not just for himself, but for a justice he never knew he was looking for. Leo's story proves that even in the most desperate of times, one brave choice can rewrite the future. What choices define your story? To ensure you never miss a tale of incredible struggle and ultimate redemption, subscribe to our channel now and click the notification bell. Your next favorite story is Waiting.